the Stephen A. Jarislowsky Chair in the Modern History of the Middle East and North Africa here at the University of Manitoba. I'm delighted to be partnering with the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities in bringing Laura Robson to talk to us today about mass violence in the Middle East. This is work that Laura Robson brings to us based on a book that she's published called The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East, published recently by Oxford University Press. And I'm particularly pleased to have Laura here to talk about this because it's so topical in the world that we're living in today. It has a lot to teach us about what's going on in the Middle East today. But this is also a subject that grows out of work that Laura has been doing for many years now. She and I met back in the late 2000s at a decolonization seminar that was taking place in Washington, D.C. And it's been a real pleasure to see, to read her work as it's come out over the years. Her first two books, a monograph and an edited volume, dealt with minority populations in the Middle East that have emerged in the 20th century Arab world and the ways that they've been marginalized in the Middle East. Subsequently, she went on to work on partitions and population transfers, related topic and very deeply relevant to what she'll be talking about today. Again, publishing a monograph and an edited volume on that topic. So her work today, The Politics of Mass Violence, about which she'll be speaking, really emerges from, over a decade of work in this area, and I know that we will all really enjoy hearing what she has to say. Her current project is a new book that looks at Franklin Roosevelt's M Project, which was a scheme to identify empty spaces around the globe where sort of so-called racially undesirable refugee populations might be settled en masse. So we will look forward to that work coming out. And in the meantime, I would like to welcome Laura Robson, who is Oliver McCourtney Professor in History at Penn State University, to talk to us about her recent book, The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East. Join me in welcoming Laura Robson.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. And I want to thank Jennifer for the kind invitation to come and speak with you today, and also to thank the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities for all the support that they've shown. I'm really delighted to be here and delighted to have a chance to talk about some of these issues with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that will work. Yes. All right. So my book actually starts with a quote, and I thought I would start with that as a kind of beginning point for thinking about some of these issues as they relate to mass violence in the Middle East. And the quote comes from Michel Aflaq, who was a writer and lawyer, and most importantly, for our purposes, the founder of the Ba'ath Party, which dominated Iraqi and Syrian politics for most of the post-1945 era. And in 1940, he wrote a book where he thought about the nature of violence. And what he said was, quote, "When we are cruel to others, we know that our cruelty is meant to bring them back to their true selves, of which they are ignorant." So this idea that political violence had a purpose is a very common one in this period. And we know that similar ideas appeared in the work of other mid-century anti-colonial thinkers. Of course, the famous writer Frantz Fanon, above all, whose passionate 1963 text, The Wretched of the Earth, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, depicted violence as a kind of cathartic force. For him, not for the victim, but rather for the perpetrator, who he thought through the practice of violence could be, as he said, freed from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. So this book project starts from their premise, because writers like these understood something centrally important about the phenomenon of 20th century violence, and that is that it was not merely some kind of atavistic impulse or a sign of societal breakdown, but rather a political decision. It was a deliberate strategy, and it was undertaken by identifiable actors at particular times for particular purposes. Now, I think that we really have to say this explicitly and clearly and loudly, because this is not how the phenomenon of violence is usually understood with regard to the Middle East. Certainly in the public sphere, but even to some degree among historians and other scholars, violence is understood differently as the kind of regrettable surfacing of varied tensions. We know that popular commentators and journalists and media in general tend to regard violence as a kind of, in the Middle East in particular, as a kind of more or less inevitable expression of what they see as long-standing sectarian or ethnic or national divides. Historians tend to treat it slightly differently, as a symptom of other phenomena, like, for instance, the tensions arising from modern forms of globalization. The first of these models, viewing it as a consequence of, millennia-old religious divides, for instance, is not just inadequate, but actively wrong. And many, many scholars, including myself and some of my earlier work that Jennifer referenced, have spent a lot of time and energy over the past couple of decades debunking these myths of long-standing sectarianism and communal hatred in the Arab Middle East. The second view, although it can be extremely useful for understanding specific local histories and for coming to terms with the emergence of peculiarly modern forms of ethnic and class and communal tensions, nevertheless also leaves, I think, some pretty major unanswered questions about how violence came to be such a pervasive feature of the 20th century Mashriq, which is what we call the Arabic-speaking Eastern Mediterranean. And it happened across national borders, across regimes, and across long spans of time. So what I wanted to propose, and what I did in this book, was to rethink the history of the modern Mashriq through the lens of mass violence. And doing that by tracing episodes of large-scale violence against civilians, usually defined ethnically or communally or politically, across what historians like to call the long 20th century, that is, from the late 19th century to the present. So this is actually kind of an unusual approach, because the study of mass violence as such has been mostly confined to the field of genocide studies, which, as some of you may know, focuses almost obsessively on questions of definition. So for genocide studies scholars, the question of which instances of mass violence count as genocide, which is usually reckoned either under the legal definitions of the UN Convention on Genocide, which you can see here, or with reference to the writings of the Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who was the coiner of the term, has become the kind of central issue of the field. So the analysis of genocidal violence typically attempts first to kind of tease out, it takes these premises as the definition of violence, the ones you can see here, and it attempts first historically to tease out which events might constitute genocide under these specific legal definitions, and then it tries to offer typologies of such genocidal violence. But recently, scholars have started to think that there are actually fairly significant problems with thinking about genocide through this legal lens. Donald Bloxham and Mark Levine, who are both historians of European genocide, founded the series in which my book is published, and they did so specifically to address what they saw as significant problems and even some kind of major intellectual failings of the field of genocide studies. They thought that genocide studies had, quote, created a conceptual trap for itself because of the inbuilt focus on instances that qualify as genocide, either according to strictly legal or somewhat broader social scientific criteria. So let me continue in their words to demonstrate this point. They said, quote, "Indeed, the near obsession with questions of definition in genocide has not only exhausted in often sterile debate the energies of the scholars concerned, it has also served to bolster an implicit moral hierarchy of mass violence in which anything not qualifying as genocide is downplayed." This has had a knock-on effect in terms of historical understanding, with instances of, quote, outright genocide being accorded more attention than other related phenomena, and more important, being extracted from historical contexts in which other instances of, quote, lesser violence are intrinsic to the picture. So they said, overall, the focus on genocide as such often equates to a focus on outcomes rather than causes and processes that may or may not produce the fully crystallized crime of total murder. So, in other words, the field of genocide studies' exclusive focus on the question of which cases count as genocide vis-a-vis this formal legal definition that we can see here, and the kind of hierarchy of violence that that implies, has seriously limited the analytical capacity of historical work on the broader context and phenomenon of mass violence. And it's also meant that the genocide studies framework has only very rarely been applied to broader geographies. For instance, it's almost never brought to bear on the Middle East, even though mass violence is clearly a defining characteristic of the region's modern history. So these are two fields that just haven't come together in a meaningful way. And I should say, too, that this is a divide that works both ways. If we have the problem on the one hand that genocide studies hasn't been interested in the Middle East, we also have some serious limitations within the field of Middle Eastern studies that have made it hard to imagine a really truly transnational history that examines mass violence seriously as an analytical category. And that's really because, as Jennifer knows well, modern Middle Eastern history has long been committed to profoundly nationalist frames of reference, which is actually common in all kinds of post-colonial literatures, and it can probably be attributed to a kind of reflexive defense of post-colonial nation states that are facing profound challenges. But it really has kind of prevented scholars from recognizing and exploring transnational and transregional themes in the Middle East's modern history. So as I started to think about writing this book, it seemed like a project that could maybe break apart some of the problems of genocide studies, but also that could begin to break apart some of the limitations of the historiography on the Middle East as well. So, what might an approach focused on these regional structures of mass violence be able to tell us? The European historian Charles Meyer has argued quite powerfully that the most fundamental marker of the 20th century across the globe was not industrialization or nationalism or the confrontation between authoritarianism and democracy, or even some kind of ambiguous understanding of modernity, but rather he thinks it was what he calls territoriality, which he describes as an enhanced concept of territory, not just as an acquisition or as a security buffer, but as a decisive means of power and rule. So this is making a distinction between the kind of relatively light control that pre-modern states often have over the territory that they claim, and the kind of intensive saturation of space with the mechanics of state power that we see across the 20th century. And this saturation of territory with the mechanics of power is deeply intertwined, I think, with the emergence of mass violence as a characteristic feature of the politics of the 20th century Eastern Mediterranean. Second, it also helps to illuminate the emergence of a new kind of ethnopolitics, an increasingly ethnically, communally, nationally, linguistically conscious form of politics. Because states that were trying to territorialize their power in this way also, in the process, territorialized ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities and identities in new and often quite toxic ways. So today with you, I want to focus in on 3 examples of this entanglement between ethnic politics and the phenomenon of mass violence as states tried to exert their authority and demonstrate their capacity to control territory across the 20th century Middle East. And I should say that there are many other case studies as well. But we'll pick 3. We'll start first with the construction of the French colonial state in Syria and discuss its relevance for Christian-Muslim relations. Second, I want to take you through the emergence of an ethnically organized military state in post-1948 Israel. And third, we'll take a look at territorial control over mostly minority areas in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And then we'll come back to this broader question of what applying this kind of analytical lens of mass violence to the history of the 20th century Middle East can tell us that we didn't know before. Okay. So let's first look at the mechanics of colonial territorialization. As I'm sure many of you know, the British and the French occupied most of the Arab Eastern Mediterranean during the First World War. And upon their defeat of the Ottoman Empire, they added most of that territory to their colonial empires with a show of bloody force that used invasion and occupation to create and intensify local, ethnic, and communal divisions. So for an example of how this worked, and we should say that many of these conclusions can be extended across the British and the French colonial possessions in the Middle East and elsewhere. But for an example, let's take a look at the French response to the anti-colonial Syrian revolt that began in the southern part of the state in the statelet, as they called it, that was carved out as a Druze enclave in 1925. The revolt, which became known as the Great Syrian Revolt, began after the French High Commissioner invited several local leaders to a meal for the purpose of discussing their protests against the French colonial government, and then took them into custody when they arrived. There was a subsequent local insurgency reacting with fury to this mistreatment and also to the brutalities of the mandate in general, that managed to take over control over several villages, and at first defeated a French column of 200 soldiers, and then, not long thereafter, a much larger one of 3,500 men sent to salvage the situation. And this is an important moment. This is not merely a local uprising. Even though it starts in the south, when word of the victory reached the cities, ex-Ottoman officials and Arab activists across Greater Syria, which included places like Damascus, which was in some ways the epicenter of Syrian nationalist organizing, but also extended actually beyond the borders of the Syrian state into places like Transjordan and Palestine. So we have this collection of leaders who traveled to the Jabal Druze to support the rebels. And in October of 1925, some of the revolt's leaders planned their re-entry into Damascus, hoping to take it for the rebel forces. Instead, they met with a French bombing campaign so brutal that it destroyed nearly all of the old city and killed at least 1,200 civilians and possibly many more. The international press reported this exercise in French colonial mass violence as an exercise in gratuitous brutality. So I'm going to read out a quote from the New York Times contemporary coverage of this moment. They reported, quote, "About a fortnight ago, the French burned several villages to the southeast of the city and brought a couple of dozen corpses of brigands to Damascus, where after parading them on camelback through the main streets, they exposed them in Marji Square. The parade was a revolting spectacle as the bodies rocked in rhythm with the camels' movements. At midday, the French sent tanks through the city and then passed along the bazaars at a terrific speed, firing right and left without ceasing. They started at 6 o'clock that evening to bombard the old city. Words fail to describe fittingly the spectacle which the ancient and sacred city now presents. A good deal of damage was done by fires, either lit by marauders or caused by shells and bombs. In many places, debris is still smoldering. So, having engaged in the wanton destruction of Damascus and the mass murder of its inhabitants, the French administration now started to recruit and arm destitute Armenian refugees. Most of these were survivors of the Armenian genocide who had landed in Syria during and immediately after the First World War. They also recruited some other small displaced Christian communities, displaced by the violence between the French. And they recruited these fairly desperate communities to join the colonial military to assist the French cause. This development, in which the French targeted liminal Christian communities as participants in an extremely violent colonial military effort, rendered Armenian Syrian Arab relations much worse than they had been, and in general, worsened Christian Muslim relations and contributed to a notable rise in sectarian popular violence over the next few years. So, in other words, the French had deliberately created a new divide between Christians and Muslims in colonial Syria. And now they decided to make use of it. They used the sectarian colonial policy to justify French brutalities as what they called a necessary response to religious conflict. As the revolt wore on, which it went on for another couple of years until 1927, the new French High Commissioner put into place martial law, and that enabled the French administration to arrest, imprison, sentence, and execute Syrian citizens without trial, all of which it did with impunity. They executed 355 Syrians without trial and sentenced many more to prison and hard labor in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. French mandatory officials were actually called to Geneva to the League of Nations to account for their behavior. And they explained that such brutality was regrettably the only way to maintain order in a country where, they said, primordial sectarian difference, their words for the tensions that they themselves had created by coercing desperate refugees into colonial military service, precluded the possibility of peaceful coexistence. So we can see here how the French created a new sectarian politics in Syria through the use of mass violence to saturate their territory with French colonial control. Eventually, this state of affairs in Syria, as elsewhere, gave way to what we call decolonization, which is basically a euphemism for the utter refusal of both the British and the French to give up their claims over Middle Eastern land and resources until they were confronted with force. In Syria and Lebanon, the French were removed, somewhat ironically, by British soldiers and their Free French collaborators. So this happened in the context of the Second World War. Next door in Palestine, the British were driven out not just by Arab resistance, but also by militant Zionist settlers whose Jewish proto-state they had themselves fostered. And now I want to turn to Palestine next door and look at the history of the early statehood period in Israel, this immediate post-1948 period, which is also an example of this, a post-colonial example of this intertwined relationship between state territorialization, sectarian politics, and the phenomenon of mass violence. Post-1948 Israel was from the beginning a highly militarized state. David Ben-Gurion, who was now serving as Israel's first prime minister, considered compulsory military service what he called a workshop for pioneering fighting youth that would serve as a consolidating factor in forming the new image of the nation. So you can see some of the imagery here surrounding the birth of the state. And alongside mandatory conscription, which remains an important part of the state to this day, Ben-Gurion put into place institutional links between the military and every civil sector as part of his imagining of a nation in arms. He thought that ensuring military representation in all sectors of Israeli society might foster a national political coherence in a radically disparate and fragmented national citizenry. So Israel's militarization, in other words, came to be seen right away as a mode of political survival. So this is one thing to note about this moment. But second, Israel, as a new state, took its cues from the British mandatory government that preceded it in becoming an ethnically hierarchical state. And it used its military to enforce this ethnic hierarchy through territorial means. In early Israel, Ashkenazi elites dominated every aspect of Israeli society and all of its major institutions. So that includes the officer corps, the Histadrut, the Knesset, and the cabinet. In other words, we could say, and I think should say, that Ashkenazis in Israel, especially those who are not recent immigrants who had been in Palestine during the Mandate period, occupied a position that was strikingly similar to Sunnis in Iraq or Maronites in Lebanon, and that is that they enjoyed structural privileges through legal and military mechanisms that derived from the place's recent colonial history. And this domination took on important spatial as well as political aspects, as marginalized ethnic communities, which included Palestinians, of course, but also Mizrahim, and even to some extent, post-World War II European immigrants, were relegated physically to less desirable spaces within the state, and thus were removed, both literally and figuratively, from access to power and resources. So this is how this is manifested in a number of different ways, and it's how the state begins to physically articulate both its own territorial control through the exercise of the territorial segregation and creation of ethnic hierarchies. So post-independence Israel entangled state authority over territory with the use of mass violence. On the occasions that organized resistance challenged Ashkenazi hegemony, the elites dominating the state had both the will and the capacity to put it down with violence, particularly against non-Ashkenazi groups, whether Palestinian or Mizrahi. So the clearest example of this is, of course, Palestinians who lived in delineated spaces of martial law for nearly 2 decades after 1948. But they were not, in fact, the only ones targeted by this kind of state violence. And we can see that the Israeli government's military reaction to Mizrahi riots in 1949 and 1959 actually bore a fairly close resemblance to things like its crackdown on Palestinian demonstrations in Nazareth on May Day of 1958. We also see the active pushing out of Mizrahi citizens within Israel into what are called development towns. So these removed areas in what are less desirable sections of the state. You can see some of these. They were concentrated in transit camps. They were placed in these towns with greater with more population in smaller spaces and less desirable shelters. This is a tendency of physically separating what Ben Gurion called Oriental Jews from Ashkenazis continues for some decades. And throughout this period, Israel also suppressed internal dissent and tried to win international sympathy for its militarized government practices by highlighting the necessity, the kind of perpetual necessity, as it argued, of force against its external enemies. So, as Moshe Sharet wrote in his diary in 1955, quote, Ben Gurion himself said it would be worthwhile to pay an Arab £1 million to start a war. But in practice, like some of the other post-colonial examples we could discuss, Israel often deployed its weapons not against external enemies, but against populations within its own borders, as a way of laying claim to territory and of establishing the legitimacy and the viability of the state itself. So in other words, in the 1950s and 1960s, Israel's leaders, like their counterparts elsewhere in the Middle East, we should note that this is a pattern, this is a regional pattern that we can observe in Syria and Iraq, among other places, They were building a new post-colonial polity that took European colonialism as its model. And that was one in which a discourse of militarization, of ethnic origin, and of the ongoing practice of mass violence all became absolutely central to state claims of legitimacy and state practices of governance. Okay, so for our last case study, I want to take you to look at mass violence against civilians in a different and later post-colonial context, and that is Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the campaign against Iraqi Kurds that took place during the Iran-Iraq War that became known as the Anfal. To sort of set the stage for this, the Ba'athist Iraqi state that we're discussing here emerged in the 1960s and 70s out of a long and brutal British colonial period, first of all, and then out of a period of military instability that was encouraged by the United States, among others. And the Ba'athists followed their colonial predecessors in relying on violence to establish the government's legitimacy and its validity, and above all, its capacity to govern over specific territory. So during the Iran-Iraq War, this regime became another clear example of the idea of territoriality, of the saturation of territory with the mechanics of power, coming together with ethnic politics and mass violence in the context of a different kind of global imperialism. So, this is a slide I forgot to show you, but it shows the military government in the Galilee in Israel in the 1950s, and Palestinian communist marches in solidarity with Algeria in 1958. So you can see the kind of mass violence that was being enacted here as well. So turning to Iraq, to Ba'athist Iraq, let's just review very quickly what happened here to kind of set the stage. You see here a map of the Iran-Iraq War, which took place between 1980 and 1988. In this context, the Kurdish question had been a source of tension with Iran for some time, but we need to note that the ethnic politics of this wartime situation were not, in fact, clear-cut at first. There were Kurds on both sides of the Iran-Iraq divide, and political negotiations were ongoing throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. So we can see here Saddam Hussein meeting with Reza Pahlavi, as well as the Algerian leader in 1975, right? The US, we need to note, also participated in the war on both sides. It supplied weaponry to both Iran and Iraq at different moments, as those of you who remember the Iran-Contra affair will recognize. And it was seeking to maintain its own position through the manipulation of local and regional politics. So here's some images of the Iran-Iraq War and a map of Iraqi Kurdistan, which, as you can see, is a border area that encompasses parts of different states. So beginning in 1987, the Iran-Iraq War was entering into its 8th year. And the regime in Iraq was facing significant internal challenges that were coming from many, many quarters within the state, including challenges in the north where Kurdish populations were most prominent. In order to begin to solidify its control over its own state territory, the Saddam Hussein regime instituted mass deportation campaigns, and it began to bomb Kurdish villages on a frequent basis. In the spring of that year, Hussein appointed his cousin, who became known later infamously as Chemical Ali, as Secretary General of the Northern Bureau, which included all of Iraqi Kurdistan, so this area that you can see on the map here in Iraq. And less than a month later, in the context of a drive to establish total Iraqi control over the Kurdish countryside, he orchestrated a major poison gas attack on the Balasan Valley. Over the next 2 days, Iraqi ground troops entered the region, and they used dynamite and bulldozers to raze entire villages. By the end of the Anfal campaign, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people had been murdered in mass executions, If we add in victims of gas attacks, disease, and starvation into the death toll, the number climbs to something like 200,000 victims. So the Unfall campaign is a useful example for us to end on, because unlike some of these other examples of mass violence across the Maastricht's 20th century, it actually was consistent, many have argued, with definitions of genocide in international law. And that's because it explicitly intended and sought to eradicate a specific population from a region through the twin step strategies of mass deportation on the one hand and mass execution on the other. But it's also an important example of the way that this kind of violence was entangled with neo-imperial interests, because this near eradication of the Kurds relied heavily on not just political support, but also material assistance from outside states. The US had provided Iraq with money and weaponry throughout the war. The chemical and biological weapons that Iraq acquired via its American connections mostly came from Germany. France also provided substantive military support in the form of missiles, tanks, planes, and helicopters. The regime also had assistance from the Soviet bloc. Hussein's much feared state security forces, which engaged in some of this violence, had been trained and informed and supplied by the KGB since the early 1970s. The Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia also supplied the regime with arms, tanks, and aircraft. And East Germany provided tanks and trucks that were used in the Anfal. So in other words, this increasingly violent relationship between the Kurds and the Ba'athist government could unfold only in a broader neo-imperial context in which Saddam Hussein's exercise of state authority depended on a network of political and financial and material support from abroad. And these neo-imperial sources of support, we need to note, fully understood the way that their provisions were being used to bolster territorial control on the ground, not against external enemies, but against internal enemies of the regime. And they supported the emergence of sectarian divisions created by this kind of violence for their own purposes. And maybe in this connection, it's maybe worth noting in passing how useful it has been in the years and decades since to US interests to have a separatist Kurdish element on the ground in northern Iraq as a potential local ally. And that that's something that arose as a consequence of the Anfal rather than predating it. So in other words, the history of the Anfal suggests that we actually have misunderstood the Cold War era in the Middle East. We usually see this period as marked kind of first by decolonization and then by a post-colonial descent either into authoritarianism, as here, or fractured forms of democracy, as elsewhere in the Middle East, which is a pattern that we can identify elsewhere in the world as well. But when we look through this lens of mass violence, we can see that there are many ways in which this isn't a period of decolonization at all. It's a period of recolonization. It's a recalibration and a recasting of empire into new shapes in which superpowers control spaces by combining economic dominance with a deliberate flooding of weaponry into the relevant territories, alongside the deliberate creation of specific ethnic or sectarian client populations, whose interests can be either held up as rationales for external intervention, as has happened in the years since, or totally ignored, depending on what was most convenient for the Western powers in the moment. And we can see that Kurds fell on both sides of that divide in different historical moments. So in other words, when we look at this particular case study, one of the things that it tells us is that our most recent instances of mass violence in the Middle East don't in fact indicate the return of some kind of atavistic sectarianism, but rather they indicate the return of empire. So I want to just briefly return to the historiographical questions that we started with, which is why it is worth thinking about bringing genocide studies, interpreted broadly, into the historiography of the modern Middle East. And I think that bringing mass violence into the conversation in this way tells us something crucially important about the broader phenomena of genocide and mass violence, because here we have a history of mass violence that doesn't really fit into the standard models of genocide and ethnic cleansing because it was and remains so deliberately engineered from outside. And to be even clearer, placing violence at the center of the 20th century Middle Eastern experience brings home one of the basic political conditions of the region across the modern era, which is the brutal exercise of imperial and neo-imperial power that marked first the creation and then the maintenance of the Middle Eastern territorial state, and is still, of course, very much with us today. Thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions and thoughts.
Thanks very much, Laura. It was great to hear that talk. And I'll say that we are taking questions via the Facebook chat. So for those in attendance, please feel free to post questions, and we will capture them and ask Laura and pass them along to Laura here. So please feel free to put some questions into the chat box on Facebook. But I'll start off with a question. As I was listening to you, Laura, and also reading your book, one of the things that you talk about, you end today on this note of how this violence has been engineered from the outside. And I think there's all kinds of historical evidence that is well known, and some of it less well known, that you've really drawn out from across a number of different examples. But one of my questions is, how do we understand the agency of local actors in that case, if we're dealing with sort of a transition from empire to an imperialism, not to post-colonialism, but to recolonization? How do we understand the agency of local actors, some of whom were, of course, victims of this violence, but some of whom were also perpetrators of this violence, and the role that they played relative to all these outside forces?
It's a really important question, and I think there are a couple of things to say. One is that in both the colonial and the post-colonial periods, these external powers looked for and found local partners in their efforts, right? That there are many ways in which this kind of state territorialization via mass violence could offer entries into political and economic power for certain kinds of people on the ground. And in the almost total absence of other avenues for that kind of political exercise and economic advancement, this becomes an attractive option for some people, right? So I think that I think that in many cases, local actors are actually quite important to the state territorialization, and that they are perpetrators of this sort of mass violence in ways that we have to recognize and acknowledge, right? I also think that we need to note that there have been so very many efforts to resist this kind of mass violence and the imposition of these brutal forms of state territorialization on the ground. And that in many cases, I think this is insufficiently acknowledged in the literature, that in many cases, those efforts to reject that kind of political violence and to build a different, more inclusive, more equitable form of governance across the region has been crushed through the exercise of force. And I think that, it's crucially important to look at agency and think about how agency works in a historical sense and in these various colonial and post-colonial settings. But we also need to acknowledge that sometimes agency can be crushed by the use of brutality, by the use of force, and that the history of the Middle East suggests, I think, that has happened more often than not, right? So when we think about the kinds of popular uprisings that, for instance, protested French colonial rule and all of its bloodshed over Syria, or protested the imposition of Israeli martial law over Palestinians in the 1950s, or protested the take Ba'athist takeover in Iraq in the 1960s. What happened to those movements? They were crushed by militaries and by other forms of violence that were often supported from the outside. So I do think that it's part of the project to acknowledge that there have been real limits to this kind of popular agency, and that we need to see mass violence as one of the crucial tools, not just for building the state, although that is part of my argument here, but also for ensuring that more popular forms of government and representation and a more popular form of politics, in fact, does not take hold. And we're still seeing that happening, and I think that it's really kind of centrally important to acknowledge the challenges that people faced and continue to face on the ground.
And as you're talking, I mean, there's a few of the elites, the sort of local agents that were collaborators, that engaged, that collaborated in perpetrating this violence. And to go back to the quotes that you cited for us at the beginning, that the purpose of violence is very much in the service of the perpetrator, and it draws attention to the role of the perpetrator here. There's another layer which occurs to me, which is that you mentioned the elites in the context of the Ashkenazi elites in Israel. You mentioned the Maronites in passing, these Lebanese Christian population that gain all of this power and status under the French mandate during the interwar years. And it seems there's a socioeconomic element here that's related to class, that's related to access to money and funds. And how do you see class intersecting and these elite statuses that came along, often, and often corrupt structures that made people a lot of money? How does that play into the story that you're telling here?
It's interesting, right? Because I think anyone who's spent time in the Middle East can, and actually this is true kind of throughout the globe, that so often when we talk about ethnic or communal designations, we're really talking about economic designations, right? In some important ways, that those are actually, you're talking about the Maronites, which is a communal designation, but also indicates membership in a particular kind of class structure in some respects, right? So I think part of the story here is the way that economic interests are sort of shrouded by their sectarian labels, and that class interests often become very important in articulating access to the state, access to military power, access to economic power. That happens in the colonial period in a number of different respects. If we think about Mandate Palestine, for instance, one of the many articulations of legal and political difference between Arabs and Jews in Palestine was in the realm of colonial salaries, right? That European Jews were paid at higher rates than Palestinian Arabs. So that's an example of the ways in which economic privilege rarely appears to us as the label for the distinction between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, but it's actually quite important, right? It's kind of crucially important. So I think that's one thing I would note about the way this has been kind of understood, and the way that class, one of the mechanisms through which class and economic access have been underplayed in the history of the 20th century Middle East, because we tend to use sectarian or ethnic or national labels to describe what are actually, in many cases, economic divides. I think too that there is an important material element in all of this, right? And that one of the things that happens in the phenomenon of territoriality, that as the state begins to exert energy and take closer and deeper control over its territory, what it is doing is taking control over resources, right? And so as it begins to kind of territorialize its own power, the material aspects of these kinds of identities become more important, right? So that when you are constructing a sectarian politic, sectarianism becomes important to people, not because they are suddenly more closely attached to their communal labels, but because it's the only way, for instance, to access land. So, or other kinds of resources, and we could say this about the kind of external interventions that we see as well, which often also have a material purpose, such as access to oil. So, I think there's a kind of, there's a kind of basic material history to be written here and to be thought about the way that political power is often becomes more and more closely intertwined with economic access and with access to resources, and that happens both on a local level and on a kind of international level.
And I'm seeing here, thank you for that. I'm seeing some questions coming up. Here's a question from one of our participants. It's actually from who says, "Thank you for your talk. I have heard that Israel's territorialization of Palestine was modeled on 19th century U.S. settler colonial practices of stealing indigenous land and displacing and containing indigenous peoples. This seems to work well with your claim that these incidents of mass violence are in fact a return of empire, especially if there are certain global patterns that you're discerning." So the question, have you by chance come across this idea in your research?
So this is actually something that scholars are really interested in right now, and that settler colonial studies has really been kind of increasingly interested in exploring. Um, The American historian Claudio Sant has recently published a book where he suggests that the Indian removals that happened in North America in the early and mid 19th century served as the model for what he calls an age of deportations, right? So that this is kind of the beginning of the idea that deportation is a way to claim land in imperial structures across the globe. And I think that is a convincing idea, and that the case of Palestine is a kind of a late entrance onto the scene of precisely that phenomenon. I'm not sure I would suggest that there, and I'm not sure that I would suggest that there is kind of a deliberate conscious modeling after the North American experience, although I will say that, the common use in Zionist literature of tropes like frontier and pioneering do suggest some parallels, right? And that's something that, Ben Gurion has chapters in his autobiography that are about pioneering, and the use of the word frontier comes up quite often. So there are some resonances there. But rather than suggesting that this is kind of a deliberate modeling, I think I would say that um, the North American experience provided a kind of concept of the idea of claiming land and how it could work in practice that was replicated in different ways and in different imperial settings in many, many, many places across the globe from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. And that Palestine is one of those places, but not the only one.
And what do you see as one of, I mean, following on from that, as one of the of telling this story in a more global context where we're drawing some of these connections? What does the global perspective on this and these global connections? What does that bring to this, to to our understanding of mass violence?
I mean, I think that one of the crucial kind of outcomes of this project, and something that a lot of other scholars are interested in at the moment, is what scholars like to call the de-exceptionalization of the Middle East, right? And by that, I mean that rather than understanding the Middle East and violence in the Middle East as something that is kind of endemic and particular and maybe even cultural, which is an argument that we have heard many, many times, especially in kind of popular venues over the past 20 years, that instead we need to see a global history of the violence of colonialism and the way in which that translates to a violent post-colonial era, right? That decolonization is not complete, that these superpowers take on the mantle of the old colonial authorities in exerting themselves across this territory in incredibly destructive ways. And I think that, we have this kind of old modernization literature that looked at the decolonial condition, the post-colonial condition across the globe in the Middle East and elsewhere, and said, why haven't these places turned into functional states once they gained their independence? Well, that's a global story. That's not something that just happened in the Middle East. And I think one of the answers to that question is because the violence of colonialism established the fundamental way in which a state could demonstrate its legitimacy and its control. And that was through the use of violence and especially through the use of mass violence and a kind of, toxic ethnopolitics. So in other words, I mean, I think this is a story that is replicated with local specificities, of course, in many other places. I don't think there's anything exceptional about it. I don't think the role of religion is special in the Middle East. And I think that we can really see, the long term and global consequences of imperial rule in the Middle East that really tracks the experiences of decolonizing spaces elsewhere.
Thanks. Well, I have one last question that I want to ask, and we're coming up on an hour, so we'll see if there are any last questions. Now is the moment. But one of the things that you're doing in this book that I see you doing is sort of, talking to the field of genocide studies and the deep dive that genocide studies has done into this question of definitions. And does something count as a proper genocide, or does it not count as a proper genocide? And you draw on examples in your book, both in this talk and in your book, that are numerically very, very different. Where we're talking about victims in the tens of thousands or more, and victims that can be counted in the hundreds or the low thousands. And of course, this becomes a sort of crazy conversation about how many lives matter to make it a genocide, which feels, but in your own mind, when you're talking about mass violence, what are some of the definitional boundaries that that attach to that term for you as you're picking your case studies and looking back over this long 20th century?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I would point out, first of all, that actually even definitions of genocide don't deal in the question of numbers. They deal in this question of intent, right? So intent to eradicate, intent to exterminate. The question of how many people are killed is technically irrelevant to the definition of genocide. I think that we need to, as you point out, I mean, this becomes a kind of mordant and slightly ridiculous conversation once we start thinking about hierarchies of mass violence. I think that the way I would think about it is that mass violence includes the indiscriminate use of force against civilian populations, and particularly, I was particularly interested in this book against populations that are sort of defined in some way by their ethnic or national or sectarian identifications. And that's a deliberately vague definition, because I think that we actually do need to understand physical violence as a phenomenon in itself, that is not delimited necessarily by its scope, right? And that one of the characteristics of these kinds of governments, when violence is kind of inculcated into state practice as one of its central forms of governance and forms of legitimization, is the way that the state can deploy it at will and apparently randomly, right? So as soon as we're talking, I think one of the characteristics that is common to all of the cases that I'm looking at here is that states have the capacity to deploy violence when they feel like it against the people that they feel like targeting, and that is considered an expression of legitimacy rather than a challenge to legitimacy, right? So I think that part of the point of this entire exercise is to recalibrate violence as a phenomenon in itself, right? As that mass violence is a phenomenon in itself, and to move away from these questions of definition, and that in fact, it's not either historically or kind of philosophically logical to say, the death of 5 people is less meaningful than the death of 500 people, right? And that rather we need to look at the process. This is why I'm so sympathetic to Donald and Mark's critique of the field of genocide studies, that we should be looking at process, not outcome, right? And that the numbers of dead, while that's certainly something important for historians to track, are not actually at the heart of the phenomenon.
All right. Well, thank you very much for a really interesting talk and for hanging in there with these various questions. I'd like to thank all our listeners and once again the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities, as well as our interpreters for making this talk more accessible. I wish everyone a good afternoon and have a good weekend. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.